The carrier war in the Pacific was the pivot point on which the entire conflict turned. And for the United States, one airplane formed the front line of both offense and defense during the height of the air campaign, the F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was the main shipboard fighter of the U.S. Navy for the last 2 years of the Pacific War. During the Gilbert and Marshall operations, the raid-on truck, in the Battle of the Philippine Sea and at Leyte Gulf, the entire fighter complement of the fast carrier force consisted of Hellcats. The Philippine Sea Task Force 58 fielded some 450 fighters, all of them Hellcats. And at Leyte Gulf, as Task Force 38, the carrier force was equipped with nearly 550 of them. This illustrates the astounding degree of standardization achieved in the American frontline forces, something made possible only by the vast output of U.S. industry. Japan had been gearing up for war since 1928. And their production rolled on. Like the Germans, they believed their empire was invincible. Steel capacity had doubled leading up to the war, 1/3 of which went into shipping. Warships and transports to exploit their conquests in the 30s. Ships to exploit far-flung military forces would soon be necessary. Japan maintained the world's 3rd largest shipping fleet with continued launchings. Their army was growing rapidly, and each new recruit was fanatically devoted to the Emperor God King Hirohito. By the middle of the war, Japan was fielding a force of 5 million men. On December 7, 1941, they felt ready to take on the United States. Hickam Field's mechanics were working at a relaxed pace that Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor. Unbeknownst to anyone at the U.S. base was the presence of a Japanese carrier task force just a few hundred miles away, approaching from the north. Soon they would turn into the wind and get ready to launch a devastating raid on Pearl Harbor. Flight crews hustled across the deck to their waiting dive bombers. Then came the signal for launch. The ships lifted off, formed up, and were on their way. They sighted the outskirts of Pearl just before 8 a.m. Sunday services were underway, and most of the base's inhabitants were just waking up. The fleet was spotted by a primitive American radar station on a nearby mountaintop, but was thought to be an expected flight of B-17s, arriving to take up a new duty station at Hickam Field. The Japanese flew on to their main target. Still, no one was suspicious at hearing the drone of engines overhead. The mechanics working at Hickam thought the B-17s had arrived and went on working unperturbed. So did sailors on the Arizona and other battleships anchored in the bay. Then the panic started. The rattle of machine gun fire and exploding bombs had finally galvanized the defenders, who had been taken completely by surprise. Hickam Field was one of the first targets hit, where the airplanes had been punched up under guard in fear of saboteurs. Next came the main harbor, where the enemy had expected to find their main target, the U.S. carriers. Instead, they found the Arizona and 7 other battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. 5 are sunk with all sustaining damage. The 3 U.S. carriers are still at sea and escaped the carnage. The battleship, with its big guns, had ruled the seas since the time of Henry VIII. The only change had been in technology, with ships of iron and the size of guns increasing over time and replacing those of wind-driven sail and wood. This kind of capital ship was the mainstay of every national navy in the world. As a means of projecting national power and will, they were indispensable. The whole of the British Empire had been built and maintained with them. The battleship had been and was still, at the outbreak of World War II, thought to be the primary weapon at sea. Its big 16-inch guns could hit targets as far as 25 miles inland. The U.S. Navy was devastated to lose the Arizona and the 4 other big battle wagons at Pearl. No one in the high command wearing an admiral's insignia yet realized just how important the aircraft carrier was to become. But lower down the chain of command, savvy Navy officers realized just how lucky their side had been to have been spared their loss. Carrier personnel were aware, like no others, just how the devastation at Pearl had come about. Just after Pearl Harbor, all the U.S. had as a carrier-borne strike force was a fleet of older Bearcats and Wildcat fighters. They were no match for the Japanese Zero. The Hellcat program came about through improvements of these older airplanes. Grumman had its hands full during the war, building not only the Hellcat but the TBF Avenger, a big single-engine torpedo bomber. They were most vulnerable during an attack run, having to fly straight and level at not more than 200 miles an hour to successfully drop their torpedoes. They replaced the earlier Douglas Devastators that took heavy casualties at Midway. Forced to do without a fighter escort through a mistake in attack coordination, a whole squadron was lost within minutes. It was the F-4 Wildcat which had to hold the line in the Pacific until the newer Hellcat could reach the scene. The Wildcat had been effective enough as a carrier-borne fighter during the early 30s changeover from biplane to monoplane. But after Pearl Harbor, it was quickly seen to be outclassed in nearly all respects by the Zero. The Japanese fighter was lighter, faster, and able to outturn anything in a dogfight. That the Wildcat was able to hold its own just after Pearl Harbor was due entirely to the above-average skill of its pilots. The Wildcat held no advantage whatever over the Zero except for its greater ability to survive battle damage long enough to get off a second shot. One good burst would disintegrate a Zero, which had no pilot armor and lacked self-sealing gas tanks. The Hellcat was ordered for the U.S. Navy after the initial shock of Allied contact with the superior Mitsubishi A6M0 during the first few months of the Pacific War. As a result of the experience of combat against much higher performance machines, the F6F Hellcat specification required the most powerful engine available. That was the same engine powering the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Pratt & Whitney R28 2,000 horse 18-cylinder radial. As a consequence, the Hellcat now had a speed and power advantage of 50 miles an hour over the Zero, as well as a superior ability in the ground attack role, which was to be extremely useful in retaking the Philippines from the enemy. The U.S. troops coming ashore on Luzon had a much easier time of it thanks to the Hellcats having softened up Japanese defenses on the island. The troops moving inland from the beach had a chance to appreciate what the Hellcat had done to enemy airfields beforehand. Still, they moved cautiously. The Japanese troops were known to be fanatics, men who would not give up even when beaten, preferring death to surrender. The only successful way to deal with these men was by extermination. Propaganda on both sides pictured the enemy as subhuman, unworthy of quarter or other human consideration. The Japanese loathed the Americans because they preferred surrender to death, while the Americans hated the Japanese because they preferred the opposite. Unfortunately, this two-way street between East and West featured a profound failure of communication and understanding that led to some of the most savage fighting of the war. The new Hellcat was armed with rockets and could carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs in varying denominations, usually a couple of 500-pounders on hardpoints under each wing. Once this ordnance was delivered and the Hellcat lightened of the load, it went looking for Zeros or Japanese ground targets to strafe. The Hellcat's first combat flights were made from the decks of the carriers Yorktown and Independence in August of 1943. The Zero's days were now numbered. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Hellcats shot down over 160 Zeros in an aerial massacre known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In the aftermath of Midway, where the Japanese lost 4 of their carriers along with planes and many of their skilled pilots, the way was now clear for the U.S. to begin retaking the Philippines. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf was the first objective of the huge invasion force. The battleship guns of the U.S. were answered by Japanese artillery defending the island. Troop landings were opposed hardly at all on the beaches, but Japanese resistance stiffened fiercely as U.S. Marines moved into the jungle. The Hellcats on the fleet's carriers claimed total air superiority over the contested real estate. Their first target was Admiral Kurita's center force, moving through the Palawan Passage. Hellcats bombed the Musashi, the largest battleship in the world, and sunk her. The Japanese were now beginning to suffer reversals all over the Pacific, and in their fashion continually strived to do more with less, thereby making their situation worse. The Hellcat, flying from Navy carriers and from island land bases by the Marines, continued to make life miserable for the shrinking Japanese Navy. In these days, before precision-guided munitions, there were as many misses as there were hits. But by this time, the U.S. had a lot of Hellcats and bombs to arm them with. Which is not to say the Japanese had no bite left. They did. It was during this period that the first of the kamikazes began to show up. They were named for the divine wind that had saved Japan from invasion in the 12th century during the first of several attempts by the Chinese Mongol emperors to conquer it. The only remedy for the U.S. was for the Hellcats to get to them first, before they could strike. The task was made easier by the almost non-existent skills of these particular Japanese pilots. A kamikaze pilot was rushed into combat after just a few hours of flight training. Once a Hellcat was on his 6, his mission was doomed. But now the U.S. was ready for the main landings to retake the rest of the Philippine Islands from the Japanese. General MacArthur watched from his flagship, anxious to redeem his pledge to return to the islands from which he'd been evicted 2 years before. October 20th, 1944, just before dawn, the naval bombardment commenced. Hundreds of thousands of rockets added their punch to that of the 16-inch guns of the Missouri. Supported by waves of carrier-based Hellcats, the landing craft went in. They met stronger enemy fire than had been predicted. But once ashore, Japanese response was light, almost non-existent in some areas. Other units in the multi-pronged attack came ashore with even less difficulty, much less than they expected. While still others encountered fanatical resistance. General MacArthur, accompanied by Sergio Osmeña, the new Philippine president, waded ashore at Red Beach, which was still under sniper fire. MacArthur had made good his pledge to return. Just a few days later, General MacArthur restored civil government to the Philippines, and Sergio Osmeña was sworn in as the new president. But the Japanese were not yet acquiescent to their loss. They were planning a counterattack to retake the Philippines. Accordingly, the Hellcats of MacArthur's fleet prepared to loose their power on the attacking Japanese. Enemy fanaticism and inability to admit defeat cost them what remained of the once formidable Japanese Zero fleet. Not only was the Hellcat the better warbird, but its pilots were vastly superior to the inexperienced Japanese. Japan had never been allowed a breather to recover from the Midway fiasco, and nowhere was this more evident than the pitiful, untrained flyers who now had to take on the formidable U.S. Hellcat. They died by the hundreds. There was no greater honor for a Japanese warrior than to die for the Emperor, and Hellcat pilots were delighted to oblige them. Each Zero pilot, even if not a kamikaze, knew he wouldn't survive the day. But dying for the Emperor meant a place beside him in heaven. And their families, even if not nobly born, would attain much glory and honor on earth in the process. As the U.S. closed in on the home islands of Japan, the resistance of the beleaguered defenders grew more pronounced than ever. That it was futile mattered not at all to them. Japanese shipping, on which their industry depended, came under especially heavy attack. Without raw materials, such factories as remained in production would have to shut down. The Hellcats pressed attacks on everything that moved, on land, at sea, and in the air. Sometimes a Hellcat that had expended its bombs and rockets could cause a secondary explosion aboard a Japanese vessel by virtue of its heavy .50 caliber machine guns alone. Several destroyers of the Imperial Japanese fleet had already been sunk by this method of attack. Few Hellcats were now being recovered aboard with battle damage. But before the decisive campaign that decimated their ranks, the Japanese Zero was responsible for many scenes like this. Often the pilot could not tell as he came in for a carrier landing whether both of his wheels were down. And sometimes the landing signal officer wasn't there to tell him. It was to the Hellcat's credit that it would stay in the air at all after extensive battle damage. And sometimes a wounded pilot lost consciousness just as he was starting his descent. This one's engine starts to vibrate out of balance when the prop blades brush the deck. The deck crew will have to move fast to save this guy. When the Zeros still had experienced pilots, it was a formidable opponent, even when the U.S. pilot was good and his ship was a Hellcat. But in the waning days of the war, the Japanese were forced to resort to the kamikaze more and more. They knew that an invasion of their home islands was imminent, and resolved to stop as many of the ships at sea as they could. Each Zero or Nakajima fighter was armed with a 500-pound bomb that a pilot was supposed to hand-deliver aboard a U.S. ship making for Japan. To be able to do this, they had to brave not only the Hellcats in the air trying to shoot them down, but anti-aircraft guns aboard the U.S. ships throwing up a veritable wall of lead. The Japanese threw all their available fighters into the air in order to stop the invasion fleet. Often, the pilots scarcely had an hour or two in the air to prepare. In the last stages, an onboard Japanese instructor would not bother to teach the new pilot to land. Takeoff instruction and how to dive was sufficient for the Divine Wind pilot who was not coming home. The Americans, not understanding these suicide attacks at the time, could only hope that a wall of lead would stop any that had escaped their own fighters on the way in. Often enough, the kamikaze, despite his inexperience, got through to devastating effect. Most of the troops aboard the transports headed for Japan in the inspected invasion dreaded what would happen to them on the beaches. VE Day had already been celebrated in Europe, and many units expected to stand down and be sent home. Instead, they found themselves slated to be shipped to the Pacific. The most dreaded occurrence aboard a carrier was a cook-off, where the decks burned out of control. Omaha Beach was being viewed as a picnic in comparison to what the Allied reception was going to be when the first waves went ashore on the beaches of the Japanese home islands. U.S. troops who had beaten Hitler and now found themselves aboard transports heading for Japan were close to mutiny. It's ironic, but the suicide attacks of the kamikazes were what led the Truman administration to ultimately drop atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because it portended the sort of fanaticism the troops might expect to meet with coming ashore. World War II ended as it began, in flames. 2 atom bombs had finally accomplished what all the Allied efforts to date had not been able to do: to get the Japanese to admit they were beaten and surrender. The final surrender was signed aboard the Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The F-6F Hellcat had as much or more than any other aircraft save the B-29 that dropped the atom bombs, brought the war to a successful conclusion. The Hellcat continued its usefulness beyond the war in other air forces in other lands, helping the French and then South Vietnam in their futile efforts to stave off a communist takeover in Indochina. The awesome Hellcat owed its existence to a fanatical enemy that had an awesome machine of his own. But from the time the first production model of the Grumman F-6F Hellcat rolled off the line, its destiny and ultimate triumph were foregone conclusions.